Do you know those tales that stay with you, a bit like a burr on your pant leg while you walk through the woods, and even though you try to brush it out, you never quite succeed? Well, sit down and I'll tell you about the winter of 2009. It's no conventional campfire story. It's something I lived through. But if I told the real truth, I doubt I came out the other side the same. Back in 2009, located in a little town in northern Minnesota. The kind of place winter doesn't just visit. No, it moves in, locks the door, and swallows the key. Hell, people out in these parts were hardy and used to the cold and isolation. That year, everything was different. The wind seemed meaner, hungrier. It's the only way I can describe it. It all started with the snowstorms early in December. They came like freight trains, one after the other, leaving us cut off from the world. Power lines were down, and roads were virtually impassable. And then, on came the cold. A biting, relentless kind that seemed to tunnel under your doors and windows, no matter how watertight you thought you sealed them up. I'd always been able to make the outdoor trek. Never had it horrified me. When two members of the Langford family, a couple of brothers from a few miles down the road, went missing out on a hunting trip, I was part of the search party. We made our way between the peaks and valleys, shouting into the wind while plowing through waist-deep snow with names on our lips, hoping that somehow they just might catch the sound. But the forest remained silent, save for the creaking of heavy boughs and one another's labored breaths. It was days, then a week, and hope dwindled. That's when the stories started in. Old Man Peterson, who'd lived in the area longer than any of them, mentioned the Wendigo. A thing of legend, he said, born from the darkest corners of winter and human desperation, a spirit that would possess the starving, turning them into cannibals. We all laughed it off. Folk tales, nothing more. But the seed had been planted, and in the dead of winter, a seed like that takes root. The search for the Langford boys was called off. The storms were too fierce, the risk too great. The town mourned, but somehow life goes on. Except that something in the air had changed. An unease settled over us, thick as the snowdrifts. Late January, now that I think of it. I've gone to check the traps I set up close to my property line, foolish hunting by any other name. The snow had let up finally, and here was a decent day for once. That's when I noticed the tracks. Big ones, way too large for a human man, with an uneven gait, slipping and sliding drunkenly across the lay of the land. Nature was cold sober when she made those. I followed, curiosity edging out caution, till I came to the very edge of Miller's Gorge. It was a huge drop at this location, where people would carefully cross. There the tracks ended, going away right to the edge. As I peered over, heart pounding, I could have sworn that something moved in the shadows below. Huge, and with cat-like eyes catching the light. My heart pounding, I reeled back and ran all the way home without looking behind me. I convinced myself it was a bear, maybe a moose, distorted by both shadow and the rampant imagination of a 10-year-old. But in my gut, I knew better. Bears don't walk on two legs. Moose don't have eyes that burn in the dark. The rest of the winter sped by us in one long, silent blur of storms, eerie cries in the woods, cattle found slaughtered, shadows that often seemed too near the houses at night. Some said it was Wendigo, others sneered, but we all put an extra lock on the doors. The fires burned so bright. That year, spring was as reluctant as a stray cat. When the snow finally did melt and the ground softened, they found what was left of the Langford boys deep in the woods, far from where anybody had thought to look. Authorities called it a bear. Tragic, though natural. Old Man Peterson just shook his head. No bear done that, he grumbled, but he would say no more. I don't know what I saw that day at Miller's Gorge, or what happened to those boys. But I know the winter of '09 left its mark on me, really all of us. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I can almost hear it whispering, hungry, relentless. So that's my story. True or not, I'll leave that for you to decide. But around these parts, when the snow starts to fall and the nights get long, we remember. and we watched the woods a little more closely, just in case. This scared me more than any shipwreck I could tell about, which may be lightly italicized after what goes before unless you probably could find it convenient to stand another tale, for instance, to have the same effect. And this is a tale on how I had known that one is scared and got to know that one is not really getting started on that kind of stuff. It was a regular camping trip, and my 3 buddies, Mike, Alex, and I, were going out again. We were the last bunch of boys who ever truly swung to live for the sake of adventure, to push the very limits of what was possible beyond city cacophony. The roughness was home and our supremacy against everything that tested us. Now it was home, and all my buddies, Mike, Alex, and me, were going out on a camping trip. We were at a beautiful camp by a quiet little lake, its waters clear and glassy, reflecting the big, never-ending sky above. It would make the perfect setting for a picture postcard, the conventional first day with everything falling in place, right from fishing to hiking, and culminating in the obligatory closeout of stories around an open fire with darkness punctuated by the crackling and hissing flames. Mike wanted to share a tale he had heard from one of the locals about some creature wandering these woods preying on the lost and weak. He called it a wendigo. Alex and I laughed at our own misfortune. We heard every scary story or legendary tale that adults use to scare children into good behavior. Still, there was something in the way that Mike recounted the story, a sort of seriousness in his eyes that I've never seen before. The birth of one grown from the human who could not control his hunger, driven by greed to become a beast that stripped men's flesh. A story meant to keep from eating one another, a word of caution from the time when scarcity of food meant unsureness of surviving. Night was becoming significantly colder, and a thick fog from the lake rolled up on our camp and actually draped it with a wet, soft kind of cloth. Shadows were weirdly long to stretch away from the fire licked by dampness. And suddenly, amidst the sizzles of the wetwood and the distant hooting of an owl, there came an overwhelming howl as though from all around us. We kidded around that it was a wolf or maybe even a coyote, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Finally thinking it best that we all just turn in, and we headed for the tents, where there was little comfort in the sleeping bags to provide an escape from the unknown. I woke to a rather disquieting sound, one heavy even treading from whomsoever might be walking around our camp. But this walk wasn't so much prancing as a bear would make, nor too light, something like a trotting of a deer, human but not so much. I peeked through my tent, and what I saw was really nothing more than the fog, dense and solid in the moonlight. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a quiet so thick, it felt like a scream. As the silence had stopped, the howl again ripped the night open, louder and closer this time, tearing into the heart of it, filled with hunger and rage. We stepped out of our tents and clustered near the dying fire, peering through the impenetrable fog into the shades of night. That's when the silhouette emerged, a figure so tall and thin it seemed ethereal, its very eyes alight with a malevolent glow. We didn't wait to see what it wanted. We grabbed our flashlights and ran. The fog made us disoriented, muffling our footsteps like some dream. We had no idea where we were going, only that we really needed to get away from whatever was following us. The forest was closing in on us. The branches clutched at our clothes, and the roots entangled our feet. We had lost our way, and the familiar trails, in our panic, seemed alien to us. That's when we stumbled upon an old dark cabin window, the door slightly ajar. We bar the door behind us and barricade ourselves inside, gasping and wild-eyed, waiting for the morning. The little cabin looked like it had been left alone for years. A cloud of dust seemed to rise from everything. It was a safe haven for the time being, but right then, it felt like more of a tombstone, cold air. There we would stand waiting, in that place from which the howl burst again, rounding the cabin and returning to us as a challenging echo. We slept not that night, or if ever we did, it was fitful dreams filled with glowing eyes and gnashing teeth. Morning came, but the fog had now cleared to reveal a forest that could surely be nothing like the one through which we ran in our terror. We made our way back to camp with the day emboldening us, only to find our tent shredded and our supplies scattered. The hike out of there and back to civilization was wrapped in a veil of silence, as everyone, myself included, seemed to get lost in their own thoughts trying to sort out what had just happened. Little was said regarding it. We seemed to have some kind of tacit agreement about letting those woods and what happened there stay. Alright, buckle in, 'cause I have a tale that might just chill you to your very bones. Something that happened to me last winter that I can scarcely believe myself. Yes, it is indeed one of those kinds of stories that are straight from ancient myths or horror flicks, but at the same time, I can swear to you that my word on the subject holds no lies. It started when my friend Mike and I began feeling a little out of sorts from the routine hustle. Two buddies thought that 1 week in some cozy accommodation in the middle of a snowy Ashland region was just what we needed. Fresh air without a cell service, just nature. And that nice little cabin rental from some old-timer who kept warning us about the hard winter. The first week was paradise. We even went hiking and caught some fish from the local stream. Every night we would be sitting around the fire telling stories when sipping on some whiskey we brought along. It was on the 4th night, though, that things changed into something surreal. We sat inside while the storm howled outside like a pack of wild animals, and then we heard them. Faint, desperate howls that really couldn't have been wholly human or even animal in nature. Mike joked that it might be the Wendigo. This kind of old creature his granddad used to scare him. He said it was some sort of spirit of the winter, hungry all the time and always hunting. We laughed, but the howling grew louder. It only became closer and more pitiful. On the morning after, we found tracks outside, like nothing else we had ever seen. Too huge and marked with claws that fairly screamed bipedal, though certainly not human. Certainly not wholly human. The cabin was circled with those prints, leading off into dense trees that even the day seemed afraid to approach. He was more than willing to go after them. A certain curiosity burned brighter in his eyes than caution ever could, but I convinced him against it. So, we agreed that we would only stay close to the cabin, as when day fell and night once more took over with its grip of cold, the feeling of being watched overcame us. We became more frightened, doubling back and locking the cabin doors and windows, but the howling came closer again, circling us while we tried to convince ourselves that the night held nothing more than the wind, a simple animal, anything really, besides what we believed it to be. It wasn't until the next day, during which we found what was left of a deer by our cabin. It had been torn and shredded into oblivion with such violent racking strength that it shook us through to our very bones, and all around it those same tracks. But now we can no longer deny the bitter truth of what's stalking us. A Wendigo, insatiable hunger, endless winter spirit. So we dared not go out of the cabin that day, and even if there would be one the next day, ever-nearing ominous noise, as siphoned in terror as it told of death, almost peeped all light for me then. It was endless howling at night, and we shivered under covers, moved around the cabin scraping against the walls, probing, looking for a way in. Mike was ever brave or foolhardy enough to take the first chance, made a stand. We armed ourselves with whatever we might find, knives, a hatchet, and that old rifle more was for show than anything, so they say. Hardware that was a constant reminder of the thin line. We paused between a death too horrible to imagine, and we stood there in the dark. It had seemed to rise that night to its zenith, all the way down through the blackest hours, until the howling died away. The silence was almost worse, a heavy, oppressive thing that seemed to fill the cabin, weighing us down. We didn't speak. We hardly dared to breathe, each of us lost in our own terror. Without warning, the cabin shook as if something had thrown itself upon the door with such force that it may well have cracked the wood. Mike fired the rifle. The sound deafened him in the confined space. But the creature outside simply howled again in rage and retreated into the night. The rest of the night we sat back to back with weapons ready and waited for what seemed like it would never come, the day. And when finally the sun blazed over the horizon, dripping paint on the snow fields with shades of blood red and gold, we knew it was time to go. Packing what little we had, we left for the nearest town, never for once looking back. The local folks listened to our tale with a mix of skepticism and an unspoken fear. They talked among themselves, casting glances our way that suggested they knew more than they were letting on. But none would speak of it directly, only offering warnings to never return to those woods in winter. Mike and I went back to our lives, but something had changed. We'd look out the windows at night, half expecting to see those hungry, haunting eyes staring back at us from the dark. We'd jump at sounds, at the howling of the wind that seemed too much like that desperate, otherworldly cry. I've tried to convince myself it was just the isolation, the cold, and our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I know what we heard, what we saw. It is more than just a story, more than a myth. It's a warning, a reminder of the thin veneer that separates us from a world much wilder, much darker than we care to admit.